So today we'll be talking about Chapter 15, Section 1, and we're talking about the new immigrants. We're going to be talking about immigration from Europe because at this time that's where most of the nation's immigrants were coming from: Ireland, England, also Russia, Poland, etc. We'll be looking at why people are coming from those areas, as well as Mexico. We're going to be talking about really the beginning of Hispanic immigration, though Mexican Americans have been living in the United States for quite some time, really since the beginning. In fact, the first Mexican immigrants coming into the southwestern United States were coming there before it was even a part of the United States. But again, we'll be looking at why Mexican immigrants were coming into this part of the country around the late 19th and early 20th centuries, to be exact. So first off, I wanted to show you a map of where people were coming from and what types of people were coming to different areas. And so if you look at these states here, most people coming into these northeastern states were coming from European countries. But then if you begin to look at Texas, and this copy of your map is in your book as well, if you begin to look at Texas and California, then you'll notice that most of these immigrants are coming from either Mexico or even, in the case of California, from China or Japan. But millions of immigrants have come in. In fact, most of us can trace back our descent to immigrants. And most are coming here to seek better lives. Some are coming here on a temporary basis to work with temporary work visas and then going back to their home countries. But we're going to first talk about Europe, because at this time particularly, late 1800s, early 1900s, about 20 million Europeans had arrived. Most were coming to find a better life, and many were coming to flee religious persecution. In fact, there were a large number of Jewish immigrants and a large number of Catholic immigrants coming from Ireland, Jewish mainly from Eastern Europe. Jews had been driven from Russia by pogroms. This was a strategy used by the Tsar at the time to attempt to unify Russia by requiring that all Russians practice Eastern Orthodox Christianity. They were even required to shave their beards, and they were required to follow Russian culture. And the Jews refused to do so, and they were persecuted, and so they came over to the United States to flee. This population growth is quite significant. 20 million people coming in a 50-year period. That's a huge influx to our population. So this does result in a lack of available farmland on the East Coast, big competition for jobs, and it's going to create some interesting issues. For one, young people will be coming in primarily. In fact, it's primarily young people moving to the country at this time. And so, again, it's going to create an enormous amount of job pressure, which will lead to an enormous amount of racial tension. But it's also an exciting possibility. I would be willing to bet that many of our ancestors came over during this time. For example, my grandpa's dad came over from France around this time, moved to Brooklyn, like so many other European immigrants, came to the New York area because that's where the main processing station was for immigrants, and that's also, being such a large city, where so many of the jobs were. And so my accent does split between northern and deep south because of that reason, because of my mom's family that came to the New York area. So the Golden Door, as it was called, was the opportunity to come into the United States. It was seen as this open door where immigrants could come in, and they did by the millions from all over the world. In fact, 20 million Europeans were coming in. Around 300,000 Chinese immigrants came in at this time. Many attracted by the gold rush. Many wound up working on the railroads, farms, mines, and domestic service, even in private businesses. Many Japanese immigrants were coming in at this time as well. Many had come in to work on Hawaiian plantations to save up passage to get to California. In fact, Hawaii is roughly halfway between Asia and the United States. By 1920, more than 200,000 Japanese Americans had arrived on the West Coast as well. Now, people were coming from all over the world, as I said. In fact, even about 260,000 immigrants had come in from the West Indies, many seeking jobs in industry. But of these groups coming into the western part of the United States, the largest by far were Mexican Americans. Roughly 700,000 Mexican Americans had arrived in the United States by 1910. Many were fleeing the political turmoil that was going on there around the time. In fact, when we get to chapter 18, we'll be talking about a lot of the political troubles that Mexico was experiencing around this same time. For example, after Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was ousted, he was replaced by a military governor, who was then replaced by a popular revolutionary, who was then replaced by another far right-wing fascist type. So Mexico was going through some political troubles. And even by the early 1900s, it was becoming an unsafe place to live, unsafe to the point that many wanted to flee. The National Reclamation Act created large expanses of farmland out of the Great Plains and out of the Southwest, large opportunities for farmers to come in and make a living for themselves. So let's talk about the journey to get there. Most immigrants arrived by steamship. Steamships had become a very popular and cost-effective way to travel. Extremely large steam engines, meaning a very, very hot coal furnace containing steam under enormous amounts of pressure capable of moving these large vessels. And so they could sometimes be dangerous. Explosions could happen aboard one of these vessels. Most would have to arrive in steerage. I don't know if you're a fan of the movie Titanic, but that follows another common immigrant story, how DiCaprio played a very poor immigrant coming to the United States who had to travel in steerage. It's the very, very bottom of the ship. Often immigrants would have to find work on these ships to be able to afford their passage overseas. In fact, my wife and I went on a cruise, not this year, but last year, and we're going to go on one next year as well. They're nice. The cheap seats, though, are called steerage. You ride in the bottom of the boat. If you want to ride in a nicer class, then certainly you have to pay the price. Now, most of these immigrants from Europe are arriving at Ellis Island. It's still a popular tourist destination, although the immigration station there has closed. I'll show you a photograph of it in just a moment. But it is the chief U.S. immigration station in New York Harbor. Immigrants there would be inspected by doctors. If you contained a serious illness, highly contagious, then you would not be admitted into the United States. Inspectors would check documents to see if immigrants meet the legal requirements to come into the United States. If you have outstanding warrants for your arrest, we are an extradition country, meaning that we will turn you over to the country you committed crimes in. If you are considered a danger to yourself or others, whether through mental illness or a past history of affiliation with dangerous organizations, you will not be admitted, etc. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, about 17 million immigrants were processed through. And so here's a photograph of immigrants coming off of the boat. And here's a photograph of Ellis Island as it looks today. Though now it's just a tourist attraction. You can go there and you can visit, buy a ticket, and see what the immigrant experience was like at that time. New York is still one of our main immigration ports. And so next, let's talk about immigrants arriving on the West Coast. And you see here a photograph of Asian immigrants who were arriving and waiting to be processed at Angel Island. Angel Island in San Francisco is the main immigrant processing station on the West Coast. And so the same process here. Immigrants would endure harsh questioning, long detention before being admitted into the United States. But next, I want you to imagine yourself as new to an area. You've now moved all the way across the country, or even perhaps to another country. What are you going to do? What's the first thing you need? So let's just pause and think about that for a second. What's one of the first things that you would need as a new immigrant coming? Well, that's human nature. You're going to seek help from people who have had the same experience. They are less likely to judge you. They are more likely to be sympathetic to what you have gone through. And immigrants have the necessity of creating a whole new life, of, like you said, finding work, finding shelter. And you're going to seek out people who share a common culture. Perhaps you don't speak the language of the place where you are going. Well, the first thing you need to find are people who speak your language. If you've ever moved from another country, or if you've ever lived in another country, that's an immediate need, almost as much so as shelter. You're also going to seek people who share common cultural values, because no one wants to be judged. So you're going to seek people who can identify with where you're coming from. But this also creates friction between people who have come here from somewhere else and people who were born here. That idea of nativism. And it is sad and unfortunate that this culture of nativism has not gone away. That we've seen so much of that same type of attitude, even in this election. This is the attitude I'm talking about. Native-born Americans looking down on immigrants. And this cartoon, again drawn by Thomas Nast, points out some of the classic illogical reasons that native-born Americans have in feeling this way. You know, here you see Uncle Sam holding his nose in disgust at an immigrant. But the great irony here is if ever you go to the Statue of Liberty, and I have not actually got to go myself. I've been to New York, but I didn't go to the Statue of Liberty. I wish I had, though. There's a statue engraved at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. Does anybody know what that statue says?
Welcome.
Essentially, welcome. Yeah, there's a big welcome mat on our country. Though we don't always act that way, right? The statue says, and I quote, "Give me your tired, poor, hungry masses yearning to be free." It says, come on, come on, come on, come everybody. Welcome. And yet this is how we often view immigrants. Let me read some of these things for you. Sabbath desecration. That is in regard to different religions that immigrants bring. It's good we don't feel that way anymore, right? Wink, wink. Anarchy. Different political ideas that people bring with them. Poverty. Disease. It is unfortunate that sometimes people have these attitudes towards immigrants. And this is a culture called nativism. Because like it or not, we are a cosmopolitan country. That means we are a country of many cultures and many ideas. I had a neat discussion with a sociology professor the other day. And he and I both agreed that multiculturalism, known as pluralism, is essential for democracy. You see, democracy means a rule by the people. Well, the people aren't naturally going to feel the same way about everything. Uniformity is fascism. Multiculturalism is democracy. But if we are truly going to be democratic, that means we truly have to accept people with different values. But that can be difficult to do. Because perhaps the way you live or the beliefs you have, perhaps you feel those are the beliefs to have or the way to live. And if you are raised and you have grown up around people that only believe those things and they share only those ideas that you share, it can be mind-blowing to go outside of your culture. And that was my experience. I grew up in an extremely rural area. There wasn't a stoplight within 30 miles of my house. Everyone within my community had the same skin color and generally the same religion and generally the same political beliefs. And of course, that's how I was raised, so that's how I grew up. And that's what I thought. Until I went off to live in a community with people who believed entirely different than myself and people who had grown up entirely different. And it really wasn't until the summer after my first year of college where I went to work in Panama City. And I began working with people from all over the world, spending all day with them working in a little restaurant where a lot of international business students were also getting jobs. At this water park, I worked at a restaurant, and it blew my mind. It was really an eye-opening experience for me. Now, I can sit here and tell you about that, but until you have some kind of experience like that, it can be really difficult to open your eyes to think about other cultures. So it's something I would encourage you to do. In fact, in the spring, around spring break, I'm going to encourage you and give you a cultural experience assignment. And I want you to think about it between now and then. There's not a lot of details to the assignment. It's effectively to go out and do something amazing. To go out and interact with people that you've never seen before and to have some kind of experience that's outside of your cultural comfort zone. And then to tell us about it. And then you'll come back after spring break and I want to hear what you did. You can do that at any time. Anytime, if you have some neat experience like that, please raise your hand, stop class, we'll stop wherever we are, and I want to hear about it. Because that's social studies. That's going outside and really learning and having that experience. Because you see, when you associate yourself only with like-minded people, then you begin to develop this feeling that your way is the way. For example, many nativists, of course, were white, were Protestant, and were native born, obviously. And many felt their way was superior to other people's. Many objected to other religions that immigrants brought with them. And many pressured Congress to pass laws restricting the rights of immigrants, such as a literacy bill for immigrants requiring that immigrants prove they can read and write in English prior to achieving citizenship. Nativism found a foothold in the labor movement. It is sad that when you take a people who are downtrodden and you give them a common enemy, that can make people blind to their own plight. One of my favorite folk songs in regards to this subject is Bob Dylan's Only a Pawn in Their Game. And one of the lines in the song says, when you teach a man that he is better than them because of the color of his skin, it makes him ignore the shape that he is in. That he is in the caboose on the train. That he is only a pawn in their game. It is unfortunate that people as downtrodden as the American worker would find a common enemy in the immigrants. Because unfortunately, when you come to a place as a new person, you find yourself having to work for less than what others might. And that's because your situation is desperate. Perhaps your citizenship is questionable. Perhaps your immigration status is questionable. And because of these things, the only opportunities that may be available to you are less than savory and don't pay terribly well. And that has been the common immigrant experience in our country's history. It is going on now, and sadly it has been going on throughout our country's history. Whereas today it is many Hispanic immigrants. At this time on the West Coast, it was Chinese immigrants who would be forced to work for less, and labor groups would exert political pressure to restrict immigration. Just as many poor today are many poor are being used to consider immigrants a scapegoat to the plight that they're in. In fact, Congress was pressured in 1882 to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned entry to Chinese immigrants altogether. Nativists feared an extension to the Japanese immigrants and most Asians in general in the early 1900s. For example, San Francisco had segregated schools. Japanese school children were forced to go to their own schools and not allowed to integrate with white Americans there. In fact, the country of Japan agreed to limit immigration, and in return, the United States would grant greater rights for Japanese immigrants living there. The sad part here is that the Chinese Exclusion Act built a wall. Not a literal wall, but a wall nonetheless barring entry of Chinese immigrants. In fact, there were many cases of riots against immigrants, violent acts against immigrants. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 15, Section 2, and this is called the Challenges of Urbanization. Urbanization means the rapid growth of cities. And since cities were growing so rapidly, especially in the Northeast, there are some basic concerns that have to be addressed. These are problems like housing. Where are we going to put all these people? Transportation. I mean, one of the great things I love about living in a rural area is traffic's not so bad, but as our county grows in population, traffic does get more of a concern. Water. We take for granted that we can go to the water fountain or the restroom and access clean drinking water. We really do take that for granted, and I hope by understanding some of the gross necessities of life without clean drinking water will make us appreciate what we have a little better. Because when we get into sanitation, it's going to get gross. Just a little warning for you. I wanted to start with a picture of a city. In fact, this is today the second largest city on the planet. Does anybody know what city this is?
LA.
LA's in the top 10, but it's not the second biggest. Certainly not the biggest. Anybody? Not Chicago. Not New York. What do you think?
Here in America.
Maybe it's a surprise to you. This is Mexico City, in fact. The second largest city in the world. The largest city in the world is Cairo. But that's Mexico City. So, industrialization, that is mass consumption of products made in factories rather than at home, leads to urbanization because industries tend to pay better than your average job, certainly better than farms. And people flock to these jobs because of a chance for a better life. And most of these industries locate near cities for several reasons. Number one, a reliable market base. There's lots of people there to buy their products. Number two, reliable transportation infrastructure. Cities tend to be located near water or near major railways, near thoroughfares where they can move their product. And then finally, industries like to locate near sources of cheap labor, which are going to be large population centers. Many immigrants are moving into cities for a number of reasons as well, because that's where the jobs are, that's where they can find cheap housing, and that's also where their best chances of meeting other immigrants of common ethnicities are going to be. You know, if I'm an Asian American, I can move to a larger city in the Northeast, and I can find a large community of other Asian Americans. Well, there was a large movement going on in the latter half of the 1800s. It was called the Americanization movement. It was a movement to assimilate people into the main culture, meaning that when you come here from another place, of course we talked about those immediate concerns of finding a job, shelter, food, safety, comfort, etc. But there's also the long-term concerns of learning the language, of becoming a citizen, of incorporating yourself into the culture that you have moved into. And so schools began ESL programs. Voluntary groups, churches, community centers began to teach citizenship skills, English language, American history, how to cook American dishes even, and also, you know, certain quirks of American culture, etiquette, for example. And ethnic communities of other immigrants are the primary support base for many people moving into this country. Now, as farm technology increased, farms no longer needed massive labor forces. Cotton can be harvested mechanically. Corn can be harvested with a giant tractor. And no longer do you need these huge labor forces on plantations. And so many people's jobs were replaced by machines. And they began to move to cities because that's where the jobs were at that time. Many African Americans in the South were these laborers affected by mechanization. And many of them began to move to the North, and particularly to move to cities. And while discrimination in the South is legendary, discrimination in the North existed as well. And often it was in the form of job competition, because many people resented new people moving into the area who provided a cheap source of labor. And so this created tension. In fact, many of the labor movements that we talked about a few days ago refused entry for African Americans or immigrants in some cases. But let's talk about some basic concerns for rapidly growing cities. One of these is transportation. Many people who live in large cities today don't even bother to purchase a car. I know that's something you're looking forward to, and in a rural area it's a very practical thing to own your own car. Yet in a large city it may not be practical because there is not space to put your car. Traffic is a nightmare in some large cities. And so mass transit is how many people get around in large cities. Mass transit means my aunt every day in Chicago rides an L to work. It's an elevated train. It's kind of cool. I've ridden it with her before when I was a kid and went up to visit. She rides that every day to work. And then from there she gets onto a bus that finally takes her to her destination. She doesn't even drive to work. Now she lives outside the city. They do own a car to get to soccer matches and things, but otherwise she relies on mass transit. But of course, if we're talking about the late 1800s, mass transit in a city, well, it's rather limited, right? Horsepower. But next, housing. Where are people going to live? A very practical concern. Working class families wind up living in houses on the outskirts of cities, or often even in boarding houses, living in temporary dwellings. Immigrants would often have to double up. Anybody who didn't have a great job would often have to put 2 or 3 families in a home together to split bills. And these are often called tenements. The textbook definition is multi-family urban dwelling. And this can be tricky. I don't know if you've ever had, maybe you have a really large family and you're used to that already. I had roommates in college. I've even shared a room with up to 8 people for summer trips. It can be challenging, and you have to get used to no privacy. 8 people in one restroom, well, that does require just a bit of sacrifice and patience. It can also be just plain old unsanitary. One person in that room gets sick, everybody gets sick because we all share the same germs. But of course, like I was talking about, mass transit. Mass transit provides the ability for large groups of people to move quickly through a city along fixed routes. If you go on our DC trip next year, you'll get to see the subway. If you have time, you can ride on it perhaps. And while subways were a relatively new phenomenon, and not many cities had them by the early 1900s, there were forms of transit connecting people with suburbs. I'll show you a few early examples in just a moment. Because when you have large numbers of horses in a city, that creates some real concerns. For example, horses obviously poop. Nothing you can do about that. And if you're in a large city, well, street sweeping is not exactly a glamorous job, but somebody has to clean up the poop. Well, if you have a large growing city and more people bringing in horses, well, that's more and more poop. In a poorer place, without the tax base to pay for more street sweepers, you get piles of poop. It got so bad in Memphis, Tennessee, in fact, there was an outbreak of cholera, I believe, associated with mosquitoes that would breed in the poop. So bad they had to burn parts of the city to the ground and rebuild. But this photograph is what's called a dumbbell tenement. It's looking down on it from the roof. A dumbbell tenement means that you have a high-rise, well, for that time, a high-rise apartment building with many different families living on different floors. In between these two buildings, you have an alleyway. And another one of the main concerns of a large growing city is sanitation. Because you see, with no running water, for many people that served as where you dump out the bucket, if you get my drift. It's also where you dump much of your trash. People just throw things into the alley, and it's rather disgusting. But next, housing. Where are people going to live? A very practical concern. Working class families wind up living in houses on the outskirts of cities, or often even in boarding houses, living in temporary dwellings. Immigrants would often have to double up. Anybody who didn't have a great job would often have to put 2 or 3 families in a home together to split bills. And these are often called tenements. The textbook definition is multi-family urban dwelling. And this can be tricky. I don't know if you've ever had, maybe you have a really large family and you're used to that already. I had roommates in college. I've even shared a room with up to 8 people for summer trips. It can be challenging, and you have to get used to no privacy. 8 people in one restroom, well, that does require just a bit of sacrifice and patience. It can also be just plain old unsanitary. One person in that room gets sick, everybody gets sick because we all share the same germs. But of course, like I was talking about, mass transit. Mass transit provides the ability for large groups of people to move quickly through a city along fixed routes. If you go on our DC trip next year, you'll get to see the subway. If you have time, you can ride on it perhaps. And while subways were a relatively new phenomenon, and not many cities had them by the early 1900s, there were forms of transit connecting people with suburbs. I'll show you a few early examples in just a moment. Because when you have large numbers of horses in a city, that creates some real concerns. For example, horses obviously poop. Nothing you can do about that. And if you're in a large city, well, street sweeping is not exactly a glamorous job, but somebody has to clean up the poop. Well, if you have a large growing city and more people bringing in horses, well, that's more and more poop. In a poorer place, without the tax base to pay for more street sweepers, you get piles of poop. It got so bad in Memphis, Tennessee, in fact, there was an outbreak of cholera, I believe, associated with mosquitoes that would breed in the poop. So bad they had to burn parts of the city to the ground and rebuild. You see, in the 1860s, many cities have inadequate, or in some cases, no running water. Certainly not in their buildings. Indoor plumbing was a very exclusive luxury. And yet again, it's something we take for granted. Often in large cities, in the late 1800s, you would have to boil the water before you drank it. Filtration wasn't actually introduced at all in cities until 1870. And so without an understanding of bacteriology, people just got sick a lot because they were drinking nasty water. Chlorination. Chlorine is capable of killing many of the really nasty bugs. Wasn't actually introduced in cities until 1908. Again, I got to get gross for a minute with sanitation. The next picture I'm going to show you is rather disturbing. With streets, of course, with horse transportation, you have large piles of manure laying around. Open gutters are essentially ditches on the sides of streets where the water can run off into sewer systems, but without complex sewer systems, these would often back up, creating huge puddles of really disgusting, tepid water. Factories weren't exactly environmentally friendly back then. Most were powered by steam, and that means you're burning large amounts of coal, which puts off tons and tons of smoke. And so cities had a horrible smell to them. I mean, if you lived in a city, you're going to develop respiratory problems from constantly inhaling smoke. Now, contractors could find work sweeping streets, collecting garbage, or cleaning outhouses. It's honest work. It's how I started. It was my first job, was cleaning garbage. And it's tough work. It is. It's nasty work. It's honest work, but with large cities like this, you're talking about a massive undertaking. And really, no cities had sewer lines, that is underground sewage, until 1900. What are we looking at here? Well, so there's some kids playing, as Jade said, by a dead horse. What are they playing in, by the way? That's an open sewer. So it's basically a gutter where rainwater and waste can run off into this gutter and ideally get out of the city eventually. Are the kids wearing shoes? Nope. Yeah, thought I'd point that out. There's standing water. Who knows what's mixed with it? Generally, it's a pretty poor situation. But next, let's talk about crime. See, as populations grew, thieves were able to flourish because early police forces were ineffective. In fact, the original Sherlock Holmes was written in London around this time. And with a lack of forensic evidence, with the quality of detective work rather primitive at that time, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock, based his novel around the principles of deduction, of figuring out using context to solve crimes. But I want to tell you the story about a man named Dr. Daniel Holmes. It's a true story of a doctor who was practicing in Chicago as the city was preparing for its great World's Fair in 1900. And the whole city was preparing to host the greatest exhibition on the planet. Cities competed just like they do for the Olympics. Every 10 years, the World's Fair would be held. The previous, in 1890, was held in Paris. And by the way, the Eiffel Tower was built in Paris for the World's Fair. That's how big a deal this thing is. And so Chicago's got to beat the Eiffel Tower. Well, how do we beat the Eiffel Tower? That's known around the world, international symbol of France. How do we beat the Eiffel Tower? Well, the challenge was to build something that had never been done before. And so the Ferris wheel was built for the Great White City, which is where the World's Fair is hosted. Well, at the same time as the construction of this amazing Ferris wheel, and the Buffalo Bill Wild West show was there, and the city threw out all the stops just like they do for the Olympics. There was a doctor who was practicing. He was a very good-looking man. He always hired young women to be his assistants. And he would always take out life insurance policies on them. It was just one of the conditions of the job. But Chase, after a while, these young women would disappear. But no worries. He would always hire women that were unattached. And he would always just claim, well, they moved back with their families. They went back to the countryside in Illinois, whatever, It happens. It's life. And no one ever really followed up. Because who's going to challenge the word of this young, attractive doctor? Well, eventually, an insurance claims adjuster did just that. Because this man had the audacity to cash in on these young women. He was cashing in on these policies and collecting on life insurance policies when he claimed they would get sick and pass or whatever. And eventually this insurance claims adjuster began to do some research. And it was tough to get a warrant because there was really no proof. I mean, he was in good reputation, good standing. But as he continued to dig, he found there was a basement with no clear door. But there was this basement. And occasionally he would see smoke coming out of it. Well, finally he was able to get a warrant. And finally, after several attempts, they were able to discover this basement. There was an autopsy table, and there was a crematorium. You see, he was actually performing experiments on these young women, dissecting them, labeling their anatomy, and publishing his work in medical journals. Because at that time, there was no reliable way to get cadavers to study. And so med students were commonly known to dig up freshly buried corpses. Well, this man had a reliable source of the freshest corpses. And again, he was publishing his work. His work is still, you can find it in American journals. Well, he was brought to trial. Hearing the nickname Dr. Death. This is a really creepy case. In fact, the story of this is published. It's a really famous novel called Devil in the White City. And you got to read it. It's really good. And yeah, it's really good, I promise. Now, when he was brought to trial, this man was completely without remorse. In fact, he said, "I've advanced the cause of science, and I have nothing to be ashamed of for what I've done. My work will save lives." And really, who's to miss these young women anyway? I mean, it's just creepy stuff. Well, anyway, the point is he was able to get away with this for over a decade because as cities were growing so rapidly, there was no great system for keeping up with who was coming in, who was coming out. And of course, fire hazards. There was also the Great Fire of Chicago. The city once caught on fire and almost the entire city burned to the ground at one point because many of the building materials, brick and mortar, wood, weren't exactly fire resistant. Many of the sources of heat involved open flame. Fire departments were usually volunteer-based and often poorly equipped. Yet by 1900, most cities do have full-time professional fire departments. Non-flammable building materials do make buildings much safer. I mean, if the worst happened, we had a horrible fire in this room, most of the materials this room is made out of are flame retardant. I mean, the posters would burn. Our clothing could certainly catch on fire. The stuff around the room could burn. But the building itself, well, that would be okay. So, since cities were often incapable of fixing many of these problems for themselves, many individuals and organizations and private charities stepped in to try to help to relieve urban poverty. For example, the social gospel movement was a nationwide cultural movement which preached that salvation was more than personal edification, but was intended to make people want to help others. There were a number of community centers in poor neighborhoods. These were often called settlement houses. They were often run by college-educated women who would provide educational, cultural, and social services. Of course, there are a number of these today. Our county has a homeless shelter. Our county has a place for abused women to seek refuge and to help them with relocating. These settlement houses, even in the early 1900s, would send visiting nurses to make house calls to sick or shut-in people. And they would also help with personal job and financial programs. In fact, much of our community college exists for that purpose as well. One of the early famous reformers here was Jane Addams, who founded the Hull House with Ellen Gates. And here she is with her students. So anyway, there's Jane Addams, and this is one of the earliest settlement houses. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 15, Section 3. And so we're talking about politics during the Gilded Age. The term Gilded Age was coined by a famous comedian and satirist named Mark Twain, famous author of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, among many other works. He called it the Gilded Age because on the outside America looked to be prosperous, looked to be wealthy. The gross domestic product was increasing. The average standard of living was going up. However, gilded means painted over. And he called it the Gilded Age because while on the outside America looked wealthy and prosperous and shiny and exciting, but on the inside it was like a whitewashed tomb, looking good on the outside, but on the inside full of dead men's bones. On the inside, America was impoverished. Our government was corrupt. It was run by the extremely wealthy. And there were some big problems that needed to be fixed, and some that still need to be fixed. And so today's theme is corruption.
I was talking to my lawyers. They said something to me. I can't believe it. Did you really find $1 million in the trunk of a car and turn it in? Did you do that? You did that for real, huh? My man. Good for you. You know Johnny Law got it though, right?
Maybe.
Ain't no maybe about it, Mr. Richard. You know he got it. You turned that money in, he took it, and you ain't get nothing for it, did you? Why you do that?
It was the right thing to do.
Oh, that's true. That's a good answer. It was the right thing to do. The question I've been asking myself is, would you do it again? I mean, that's a lot of money. That's a long time ago. Many car payments ago, many child support payments ago. So I said to myself, the only way to find out is to find out.
Bribery, extortion, murder, racketeering.
You give me an address, I make sure the car's there, I make sure that money's in that trunk.
No thanks.
You sure? Come on now, Richie, what you think that impresses me? Huh? You think that you better than them? You ain't no better than none of them other cops. In fact, you the same as them. You are them. Let me ask you this. Do you really think that putting me behind bars is gonna change anything on them streets? Them dope fiends are gonna shoot it, they're gonna steal from it, they're gonna die for it. Putting me in or out ain't gonna change one thing.
And that's the way it is.
That's just the way it is. So what we got, Richie? We got me and you sitting here. You got that little snitch ass driver for my brother. You got a little bit of powder. You're gonna need more than that, Richie.
I got possession, supply, conspiracy, bribing a law officer. I got people who attest to seeing you kill in cold blood. I got your offshore bank accounts, your real estate, your businesses, all bought with money from heroin. And I got hundreds of parents of dead kids, addicts who OD'd on your product, and that's my story for the jury. That's how I make it all stick. This man murdered thousands of people, and he did it from a penthouse driving a Lincoln. Aside from that, you got nothing to worry about.
That's pretty good. But that's why we go to court, isn't it, Richie? Because I got witnesses too. I got celebrities. I got sports figures. I got Harlem, Richie. I took care of Harlem, so Harlem's gonna take care of me. You can believe that.
And speaking of corruption, we first need to learn about political machines. These are organized groups within a political party that cooperate to control cities, to run them like little kingdoms. How can you do that within a democracy? I thought the point of our country is that the people control. That's what Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address. Of the people, by the people, for the people. But then if you happen to come across a political cartoon on your test, maybe you saw where it said, of the monopolist, by the monopolist, for the monopolist. And that cartoon was a critic of the time that we're talking about, where monopolies were controlling politics, where people were so wealthy they were buying elections. But how could they do that? Well, number one, these political machines could give services to voters. Sometime you need to watch a movie if you're into the mob or you're into cop shows. American Gangster's one of my favorites, starring Denzel Washington. It's a true story of a mobster in Harlem who was involved in the alcohol trade during Prohibition and got involved in the heroin trade once alcohol was legalized. He ran the ghetto of Harlem as if it was his own kingdom. And that's certainly not an isolated incident. You know, Al Capone ran Chicago, Pablo Escobar ran the country of Colombia for a time, Roger Taney ran the city of New York. But how did these men do that? Well, number one, they would buy the loyalty of voters by giving them services. They would offer financial support for businesses, making businesses and voters and people dependent on these individuals or these groups. After the Civil War, machines using these methods could gain control of major cities. These were extremely well organized. The precinct captain in charge of each local precinct would often guarantee voters by, again, ensuring they would come out, by giving them services, by making them loyal through codependency. Ward bosses, like the one you saw in Far and Away, the Tom Cruise Nicole Kidman movie, could run precincts by helping immigrants get jobs, get housing, etc. But then at the top was the city boss. And There's tons of movies about these individuals, but more importantly, they were able to bypass the democratic system through very corrupt means. Now, the political boss might be the mayor of the city, might simply be the controlling member of that particular party. As boss, they could control access to city jobs. If you were going to work in that city, you had to go through this individual. So obviously that would give them a lot of power. They would control business licenses. If you're into the Marvel superhero Netflix originals, Kingpin is a great example of a city boss. He was controlling so many aspects of the city. The courts, the police were on his payroll. Businesses had to pay protection fees. That's the type of people these bosses were. They could influence the courts to keep their people out of trouble, whether through bribes or even threats. For example, Pablo Escobar, the man who pioneered the cocaine trade into the United States of the 1980s, threatened even members of the nation's Supreme Court and had them killed when they didn't cooperate. And so they could use fear, they could use finance, but more importantly, they would control these cities. In the United States, they could control municipal agencies, public services, the police. They would arrange building projects, community services. And these bosses would receive a form of taxation. They would be paid by businesses, whether in the form of protection money or insurance, or in some cases they would even be in charge of the public funds. They would get voters' loyalty through giving gifts, and they would use these gifts to extend their influence. Now, many immigrants found themselves caught up in this process because, of course, immigrants coming off of the boat had no resources. You know, Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, when her spoons were stolen, that's all she had. That was her savings. She had stolen those from her family. She was going to try to sell those to a pawn shop to get enough money to get started here. And when those were stolen, she had nothing. And so if you watch the movie, Tom Cruise actually goes to work for one of these ward bosses. He proves that he can fight, and so the ward boss makes him a thug. And he winds up having to be part of this machine that threatens and beats up and intimidates people. Many of these bosses themselves were first or second generation immigrants. And they would help immigrants get homes, get citizenship, get jobs. And in return, these immigrants owed them loyalty. This political cartoon, in fact, one of the beauties of our country is that we do have freedom of expression. We do have freedom of the press. And there were journalists that, despite threats, despite intimidation, continued to expose these people. In fact, if you watch American Gangster, the true story of the man who ran Harlem, New York, a Washington Post reporter played by Russell Crowe would not leave him alone. And it was a reporter who exposed much of the corruption. In fact, in this case, in Roger Taney, the man who ran New York as a king, was exposed by a cartoonist, Thomas Nast, who drew many cartoons like this. Now, the machines would use electoral fraud to win elections. There was a case of this near where I grew up in Polk County, Tennessee, where the local ward boss attempted to steal the election. And this was not hearsay or corruption. No, they literally stole the voting ballot boxes, and they were going to manipulate the results. And so they would use fraud like this. They would also use graft. Graft is an illegal use of political influence for personal gain. You know, this would be if I were to use my limited influence to say, hey, if you wash my car, you know, you won't have to do your next essay. That would obviously be unethical, but I bet I could talk somebody into it. It's certainly unethical. It's definitely illegal. I could be fired for it. But I bet I could convince somebody to keep their mouth shut and go wash my car to not have to do your essay. Obviously, that's immoral. But that would certainly be an illegal use. Now, I don't have that much power, right? But imagine if I did. And imagine if I were corrupt and I were interested in getting a kickback. And there are plenty of people. Machines would take kickbacks, and they would accept bribes, and they would often allow illegal activities. In fact, they were often caught up in many of these illegal activities. And this corruption is widespread. I mean, think of the credit mobiler scheme, where the fake construction company was formed to overbid on projects. When that corruption was found out, Carly, the President of the United States was implicated, though he was never proven to have been involved in that scheme. But I mean, think about it. Even the president was perhaps bought off allegedly. The most famous case of corruption in the United States is William Tweed in 1868, known as Boss Tweed. He ran the city of New York. His organization was called Tammany Hall, and he led the Tweed Ring. In running the city, he defrauded the taxpayers of millions of dollars. Of course, in today's money, we're thinking billions of dollars. And he was running the city as a king for years. And yes, people, I'm sure, understood what he was doing, but no one had proof, and really no one had the power or the influence to bring him down. But this is one of those stories where sometimes it makes me want to be a journalist. I just love it that there are people who are brave enough to expose bullies like this. In this case, it was a cartoonist. Old Thomas Nast brought down the Tweed Ring with a series of cartoons. And so the next clip I've got goes into a little bit about Thomas Nast, and then I've got a few examples of his cartoons to show you. Now, those plug uglies and rabbits in the video we're talking about were gangs. They were groups of immigrants that banded together for protection, and they represented their entire ethnic group in these particular cities. And a great movie to watch if you think this corruption is fascinating, or if really you just don't believe me and you want to see it for yourself. Gangs in New York, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Daniel Day-Lewis. Amazing film about some of these early gangs that ran their particular cities. And it does have Boss Tweed in it. I believe he was played by or represented by Daniel Day-Lewis. Anyway, here's one of Thomas Nast's cartoons. This one's called The Tammany Tiger Breaks Loose. And here you see a Roman Colosseum, the tiger representing Tammany, and he's devouring Lady Liberty. Another way these bosses would gain control is through patronage. Be careful of people who give you extravagant gifts. There's an old saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Be careful when people shower you with gifts, because they're often seeking to win influence. And that's called patronage. Patronage means that you begin to shower someone with gifts, and you win their affection through really a form of bribery. But it's not overt bribery. I'm not saying, Wesley, I'll give you an extra orange juice if you do this. Well, that's obvious bribery. Patronage is where I would say, Wesley, I got you an orange juice today. And then tomorrow, here's a donut. What's this for? Oh, no, I just wanted to give you a donut. Okay. Hey Chase, I brought you, I heard you like Hershey's chocolate, so here you go. What's this for? No, just, and I just do that a little bit each day. With, handful of you throughout the day. Hey, here's I heard you like Snickers, Jenny. Here you go. And then before you know it, you're just starting to come in. It's almost like Pavlov's dog. You start coming in and thinking, hey, what's he going to give me today? Oh, cool. Hey, and then one day you walk in, and I don't have anything for you. And so Seth walks in, he's expecting something, but I'm like, here, Emily, I heard you liked Three Musketeers, so here you go. But Seth didn't get anything today. And Seth begins to think, what did I do? Why didn't I get a piece of candy, but Emily did? That's patronage. You see, it's a form of manipulation. So be careful when people give you gifts, especially when it happens often. You know, I have a friend who's a sales rep, and it's just his nature. He gives out his product. And every time we go paddling, he's like, here, guys, anybody want some free samples? And it's a form of advertising. Well, you know, he's good at his job. All he does is, anywhere we go somewhere, he's just said, hey, I've got this whole box of samples. Anybody? And people are like, well, okay. You know, well, really, he's advertising his product and building his business. In this case, jobs were the patronage. Hey, Jordan, I hear that you're good at legal services. I heard you did well on the bar exam. I can hook you up. That's a big one, right? That's not a Three Musketeers. That's a career. But Jordan knows if he's going to get that legal job, he's got to come through me. And he knows that in order to keep his job, he needs to keep me happy. Again, watch The Godfather. If you don't believe me, this stuff's real. And it was going on. Civil service jobs, that means government positions in many cities in America, had gotten so corrupt that they were all patronage jobs. All. I mean, that's unfathomable that our country had become so corrupt at that point. Now, many of these appointees are not qualified. Jordan hasn't passed the bar exam. You know, maybe he will someday. But let's be honest, that's probably 5-10 years away. But again, if it's my job to give, I can give it to him. Now, that type of system is not a merit-based system. He didn't earn that job. He got hooked up because of who his dad is or etc. And of course, I'm giving that influence. I'm using that influence for my personal gain because now Jordan owes me big time. And many reformers are going to try to fix this system. Because let's be honest, if I hook up Jordan with a job in law, you're not going to want him to represent you if he hasn't passed the bar exam. If he hasn't proved the most basic competency, then you don't want him as your lawyer. But he's your lawyer because I hooked him up. And that's a corrupt system. That's not a good system. But again, that's the way some things are. And so reformers are going to try to press to create a merit-based system. It's a big slide, lots of information. In fact, I think I've got new personal record, maybe 4 presidents on one slide. And there's a reason why 4 presidents on one slide. Because some of these individuals are going to try to go up against the corruption. Most of them will fail. Some of them will be bought off. So let's run through the list. Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president in 1876, and perhaps the most corrupt election in American history. That was the one where he lost to Samuel J. Tilden by the popular vote. But through a secret deal with party leaders, Reconstruction came to an end and Rutherford B. Hayes became president. And so he's already starting out with a very bad reputation. A lot of people are saying this is so messed up. And I would agree with them. However, perhaps in an attempt to clean up his name, perhaps in an attempt to reform the government that he is now running, he named several independents to the cabinet, and he created a presidential commission to investigate corruption in the United States. In fact, this commission revealed that many top officials in our government were accepting bribes from political machines, and that our government wasn't even responsive to voters, that democracy was failing. I mean, this commission reported and said, hey, guess what? We all knew it was true, but now we have proof our government is not even a democracy. Congratulations. It's messed up. And so Hayes responded by firing 2 of these corrupt officials, hoping to make an example. And this angered many of the stalwarts within his party. The stalwarts were the kind of corrupt machine base. So the Republican Party turned away from Rutherford B. Hayes because he didn't play by the rules. And they appointed James Garfield. And Chester A. Arthur was appointed as Garfield's vice president. Meanwhile, Garfield. So Hayes was made an example of. He didn't follow the rules. He tried to end corruption, and the Republican Party turned their backs on him and did not appoint an incumbent president for re-election. I mean, that's just messed up. Why? Well, because he tried to break the corruption. So the next guy they picked, James Garfield, did the same thing as Hayes. In fact, in some cases, he was giving jobs to reformers to try to fix the system. Now, one of these jobs that he gave to a reformer, he didn't give to the man who had been promised that job. So the man who was expecting the hookup, who had done the favors, who had done the dirty work to get that job, was turned down. They killed him for it. A president of the United States was murdered, assassinated, because he didn't obey the mob. I mean, how messed up is that? This is where we are as a country in 1880. Of course, the president dies, vice president takes over. Chester A. Arthur, at this point, is having to deal with a country that just lost its president because the president was trying to clean up corruption. I mean, again, like, the mob movies are often based on true stories. I'm watching Narcos right now. It's kind of dark and very violent and disturbing to watch, in fact. And it's a true story. A man ran for president in Colombia promising to end the cocaine trade and break up the mafia there. And they killed him as he was going to accept the results of the election. And his successor, when they appointed, hey, you're going to run, he was like, oh man, not me. They're going to kill me. And just in the process of running, there were several attempts on his life, including a suicide bomber on a plane. And it's just, I'm like, this is too disturbing to be true, but it is. These things do go on. So Vice President Chester A. Arthur urged Congress to pass a civil service law. And Congress finally did. It was called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. This means that appointees for government jobs would have to first pass a standardized exam. Now, this doesn't fix corruption because, for example, if you've got somebody going for a government position versus someone else going for a government position, assuming they both passed the test, you can still use patronage and you can still hook up someone, assuming they both pass the test. But at least this is designed to say that they have passed some measure of competency. And even more precedents. Because again, this is not a simple fix, guys. Corruption is something we all have to address. It's something that we all have to care about, that we all have to be involved in, to stop, to expose. Well, what are these? Why are they buying governments? Why invest so much money into paying off politicians? Well, one of the goals of many of these big businesses were high tariffs. Because high tariffs would guarantee that foreign products coming in were too expensive to sell. And so that monopolists could control industries within the United States. The Democratic Party at this time was really trying to clean up much of this corruption. They were pushing for low tariffs, which would open up our country to international competition, which the Rockefellers and Carnegies could not control, and would hopefully drive down prices and fix at least some of this corruption. In 1884, the voters finally got involved and elected, for the first time since before the Civil War, a Democratic president, Grover Cleveland. And so Cleveland won. And people were cheering. They were like, finally, we've got somebody who's going to clean up this corruption, who's not embedded within the corrupt Republican Party of that time. And he won. But it's kind of like Don Quixote. He won, but he can't beat the system by himself. He wasn't able to lower these tariffs. And in fact, in the next election, his opponents, the mob, had besmirched his reputation enough that he wasn't elected. And so Benjamin Harrison became president. He supported higher tariffs. In fact, under his leadership, the McKinley Tariff Act was signed into law. Yet once again, the voters come back and say, enough is enough, this corruption has to stop. And Grover Cleveland makes one of the only comebacks in presidential history. I think he is the only president ever to have lost re-election and yet come back to win in the next one. So Cleveland was re-elected, supported a bill that lowered the McKinley tariff. He also rejected a bill that created the income tax. But the problem was, and really and I'm simplifying here because there were many goals of the mob or the stalwarts or whatever you want to call them. Tariffs was one of the common goals, however, because tariffs allowed monopolies control. And eventually it's going to go over to the Republican William McKinley again, once again, high tariffs.